The key wouldn't turn. I stood in the corridor of the luxury high-rise apartment I'd called home for 2 years, the wheels of my suitcase still rattling in the silence of the hallway. I'd just returned from a grueling week in Chicago, or so the cover story went, and every muscle in my body ached. He wasn't alone. Behind him, draped over our Italian leather sofa, was a woman in her late 20s, swirling a glass of my vintage Bordeaux. "I changed the locks," John said, his voice dripping with a casual, predatory cruelty. "And I've moved your thrift store wardrobe into garbage bags in the service basement. Don't bother calling a locksmith. You don't live here anymore." But as the brass lock remained stubbornly horizontal, a cold, familiar dread settled in my stomach. "Looking for something, Karen?" The door swung open, but not by my hand. John stood there, leaning against the frame in a silk robe I'd bought him for our anniversary. "John, what is this?" I asked, my voice steady despite the hammering in my chest. "It's a surprise," he sneered, tossing a thick envelope at my feet. I filed the papers. "You're officially a single woman again, though woman might be a generous term for a penniless clerk like you. My friend witnessed your signature. It's done." I looked down at the folder. Inside were divorce papers, perfectly forged with my signature, claiming a mutual agreement to separate with 0 property claims. "I'm marrying Susan on Saturday," he continued, gesturing to the woman on the couch. "She comes from a real estate family. She doesn't have to count pennies to buy a pair of shoes. I'm doing you a favor, Karen. I'm letting you walk away before your poverty drags me down any further. Now take your bags and vanish. You're trespassing." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a sharp, chilling sense of relief. John thought he was evicting a frugal burden. He had no idea he had just unhooked the only anchor keeping his stolen lifestyle from drifting into a legal hurricane. Before I reveal the moment John realizes he just signed away his right to a $900,000 settlement because he thought I was too poor to fight back, I have to ask, have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they were the alpha? Drop a boss in the comments. I'm reading every story. My marriage to John was a calculated deception, though not one born of malice. I was raised by a single mother in a world where every cent was a soldier in the war against hunger. My father had passed when I was in kindergarten, leaving us with nothing but a mountain of medical debt and my mother's iron will. She taught me 2 things: how to stretch a dollar until it screamed, and how to build a fortress of financial independence that no man could ever tear down. Even after I climbed the corporate ladder, those habits remained. I wore high-quality, unbranded clothes that I bought on deep clearance. I drove a 10-year-old sedan that was mechanically perfect, but aesthetically invisible. When I met John, he saw a frugal clerk. He saw a woman who cooked at home and shopped for groceries with a list. Because I didn't drape myself in obvious labels or brag about my career at a multinational firm, his arrogance filled in the blanks. He assumed I was a small woman with small earnings. "A woman's place is the heart of the home, Karen," he told me early in our marriage, his feet up on the coffee table while I folded his laundry after a 10-hour workday. "I'm the provider. Your little job in advertising is a nice hobby, but don't let it distract you from your real duties. Once the kids arrive, I expect you to step back and be a full-time wife." John saw himself as a traditional patriarch, yet he contributed nothing to the household except his presence. He viewed my income as a drop in the bucket of his wealth, a wealth that was actually a fragile house of cards built on debt and his parents' dwindling trust fund. I managed to keep my job by framing it as a financial supplement for our future children, but the reality was a punishing double life. By day, I was a director for a top-tier American branch, managing 60 employees and a multi-million-dollar budget. By night, I was the frugal wife scrubbing the floors of an apartment he bragged about owning. The disconnect was total. He treated me with a condescending pity, often mocking my upbringing. "You're so obsessed with saving, it's pathological. You were born poor, and you think poor," he'd sneer whenever I checked a receipt. I let him believe it. I let him think I was a mouse, never realizing that the mouse was the one funding the cheese. The deterioration of our marriage wasn't a slow rot. It was a sudden, violent break. As I approached my 35th birthday, the biological clock I had suppressed in favor of professional stability began to chime. I had worked myself to the bone to ensure we had a massive financial safety net. But I realized I was building a nursery in a graveyard. I approached John on a Tuesday evening. He was nursing a scotch, staring at a stock ticker on his laptop that I knew was showing mostly red. "John, we need to talk about starting a family," I said, sitting across from him. "I'm 35. If we're going to do this, we need to start considering our options now." He didn't even look up. "Kids? You're barely keeping up with the laundry as it is, Karen. You're always complaining about being tired from your little office job. You think you have the energy for a baby?" "It's not about energy, John. It's about a partnership. I've reached a point in my career where I can take maternity leave, but I'll need you to step up. I can't do 100% of the domestic work and 100% of the child rearing while you just exist." John finally looked at me, his lip curling in a sneer that made my skin crawl. "Let me be very clear. Child rearing is your job. I am the man of this house. I work to provide the status we enjoy. I won't be changing diapers or waking up at 3 a.m. because you've decided to fulfill some biological urge. It's your child too, John," I whispered, the cold reality finally settling in. "And it's your burden," he snapped. "You must have been indoctrinated with that poverty-stricken mindset, breeding like rabbits because you have nothing else to offer." "We are not poor. We don't need kids to validate our existence. End of discussion." He stood up and walked out, leaving me in the living room. It wasn't just the rejection of a family that hurt. It was the realization that he viewed me as an inferior species. He didn't see a partner. He saw a domestic appliance that was starting to malfunction. That was the night I stopped being a wife and started being a strategist. I didn't need a marriage. I needed an exit plan. If John had been paying attention, he would have noticed the subtle shift in the air. He would have noticed that I stopped asking him about his day or questioning his late-night client dinners. But John was too enamored with his own reflection to notice the woman standing in the shadows of his arrogance. I told him I was heading to Chicago for a week-long regional summit. It was a plausible lie. My role often required high-level coordination. For the first time, John was actually pleasant. He smiled, kissed my cheek, and told me to work hard for those pennies. I realized then that his smile wasn't for me. It was for the freedom my absence provided. I didn't go to Chicago. I moved into a discreet business hotel 3 blocks from our apartment. From that room, I coordinated with Vanguard Private Investigations. I had spent 3 months' salary on their premier package, and they were worth every cent. Within 48 hours, my tablet was flooded with high-resolution evidence. John hadn't just been having an affair. He had been living a parallel life. Susan wasn't just a fling. She was a real estate heiress who believed John was a wealthy, high-powered bachelor. He had been using my apartment, the one my company paid for, as his bachelor pad, telling her I was just a live-in housekeeper or a distant cousin who handled his affairs whenever she saw my things. The real shock came on Wednesday. I watched via a long-range lens as John and Susan entered a bridal boutique. They weren't just dating, they were planning a wedding for the very weekend I was supposed to be away. He had even hired a boutique wedding planner to stage a ceremony at a private estate, complete with paid background actors to fill the seats, since he couldn't risk his own social circle finding out about his bigamy. "He's bold," my lead investigator remarked over the phone. "He's betting on the fact that you're too docile to ever check the bank statements or the lease." "He's not bold," I replied, scrolling through a photo of John signing a fake marriage license. "He's a man who thinks he's playing a game with a mouse, unaware that the mouse is the one who built the maze." I spent the rest of my trip with my lawyers, drafting the countersuit and preparing the lease termination. I was no longer just a wife. I was a predator in a tailored suit, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. John's laughter died in his throat as I stepped into the foyer, ignoring his commands to leave. I didn't look like the broken clerk he expected. I looked like someone performing a cold, clinical audit. "You're not hearing me, Karen," he growled, stepping toward me. "The locks are changed. The papers are filed. This is my house. You're nothing but a ghost in the hallway now. Get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." "That's a bold word, John. Trespassing." I pulled a laminated document from my briefcase. "You should have read the fine print of our lives. You told Susan this was your apartment, didn't you? You told her your wealth provided this view. But this isn't a private residence. This is a corporate-leased executive suite." I tapped the paper. "The lease is held by my employer, an American multinational. It is part of my director's compensation package. My name is the only authorized occupant on the master agreement. You? You're a permitted guest at best, or, as of 10 minutes ago, an unauthorized occupant." "What are you talking about?" John stammered, his face flickering from red to a pale, sickly yellow. "I terminated the lease this morning, John. The company is moving me to a new location. Since the lease is dissolved, I'm allowed to be here to collect my belongings. But you? You've stayed past the termination date, and more importantly, you've altered a rental property by changing the locks without the manager's consent. That's a criminal offense." Just then, the doorbell rang. A sharp, insistent chime. "That will be the apartment manager," I said, checking my watch. "And since I reported an unauthorized intruder who barricaded the door, I believe he's brought the police with him." The look on John's face was worth every cent I'd spent on the private investigator. He turned to the door, then back to me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He wasn't the king of the castle anymore. He was a man in a silk robe, standing in an apartment that didn't belong to him, facing a woman he no longer recognized. You wouldn't," he whispered. "I already did," I replied. "Welcome to the real world, John. It's a lot more expensive than you thought." John scrambled out of the apartment as the police arrived, clutching his dignity along with his designer robe. He didn't stay to argue. He knew the walls were closing in. His first instinct was to flee to Susan's estate, the safety net he thought would catch him. But I had prepared a special welcome for him there, too. I had sent a formal demand for reparation to Susan's home address the day before. I didn't send it via standard post. I sent it as registered mail, recipient signature required. I knew exactly how John's mind worked. He would try to intercept it, to keep the wealthy bachelor myth alive for just a few more hours. I sat in my car across from Susan's gated driveway, watching the drama unfold through the windshield. John was pacing the sidewalk like a caged animal, his eyes darting toward every delivery vehicle that passed. When the mail carrier finally pulled up, John lunged forward, hand outstretched. "I'll take that," he barked, his voice cracking with desperation. "It's for my fiancé." "I'm living here now." "I'm sorry, sir," the carrier replied, pulling the envelope back. "This is registered mail for Susan Vance. I need her signature and ID. I can't release it to anyone else." "I'm the husband, practically!" John shouted, reaching for the mail. The commotion brought Susan to the front door. She looked confused, her perfect hair slightly tousled. "John? What's going on? Why are you in your robe on the sidewalk?" The mail carrier turned to her. "Miss Vance, I have a registered legal document for you. This man tried to intercept it." "Legal document?" Susan's voice was small. She signed the digital pad, took the heavy envelope, and opened it right there on the porch. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the gate. I could see the moment the color left Susan's face. Inside the envelope wasn't just a demand for damages. It was a copy of our marriage certificate, the PI's photos of the fake wedding, and a letter from my attorney detailing the forgery charges I was filing. "John?" Susan whispered, her hand trembling as she held the papers. "Who is Karen Thompson? And why is she claiming she's been married to you for 3 years? "Susan, baby, listen. It's a mistake. She's a crazy ex-clerk. She's obsessed with me." John's voice was a pathetic shriek. "I'm not obsessed, Susan," I called out, reaching the gate. "I'm the wife who pays his bills. And you're the woman who just helped him commit bigamy. I suggest you read the section on reparation very carefully. It's going to be a very expensive wedding." 3 days later, we met at a public notary's office. John looked like a man who had been dragged through a thresher. His fiancée had scrubbed him from her life. Her father's lawyers were threatening him with marriage fraud charges, and he was currently living in a motel that smelled of cigarettes and regret. "Let's just end this," John snapped, sliding a legal document across the scarred wooden table. "I'll pay your $30,000 reparation for the anguish. It's every cent I have left in my personal account. But in exchange, we sign a mutual waiver of property division. I don't want you coming after my car or my future earnings. You're a poor woman, Karen. You need the cash. Take the $30,000 and vanish." I looked at the document. It was a total renunciation of any claims to assets acquired during the marriage. John was so terrified that I would leech off his dwindling trust fund that he was practically begging me to sign. "You're absolutely sure you want to waive property division, John?" I asked, unscrewing my fountain pen. "You don't want to see a full accounting of our marital assets first." "I know what you have, Karen. You have a discount wardrobe and a bank account that probably hasn't seen 4 digits since 2018. Sign the damn paper." I signed. The notary stamped the document with a finality that echoed in the small room. We were legally divorced, and the property was permanently separated. "Now," I said, leaning back and meeting his eyes with a cold, terrifying clarity. "Let's talk about math. You've spent 3 years mocking my poverty mindset. You assumed my salary was $15,000 a year because that's what you decided a woman like me was worth." John scoffed. "If the shoe fits." "The shoe is a bespoke Italian pump, John. I don't make $15,000 a year. I make $15,000 a month." I pulled my latest tax return from my briefcase. I am a director for the American Regional Branch. My annual base is $180,000, and with my performance bonuses and stock options, my total compensation last year was $1.8 million. John's eyes bulged. He grabbed the paper, his hands shaking so violently the page rattled. I am a frugal woman because I value wealth, John. I saved nearly $900,000 in a joint access marital account during our 3 years together. If we had gone through a standard property division, you would have been entitled to $450,000 of that today. But because you were so desperate to protect yourself from a poor wife, you just signed a legal waiver for every single cent of it. The silence in the room was absolute. John looked at the waiver, then at the $1.8 million figure, then back to me. You can't do this, he whispered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. I didn't do this, John, I replied, standing up and smoothing my suit. Your ego did. You were so busy looking down on me that you didn't even notice I was the one paying for the very floor you stood on. John's world didn't just crumble, it imploded. The realty heiress he had pinned all his hopes on proved to be as ruthless as the corporate world he pretended to master. Susan Vance didn't just leave him, she erased him. Within 24 hours of receiving my legal packet, she had her father's security team change every code on her estate. John's designer suits were delivered to the local shelter in boxes marked industrial waste. But the social humiliation was only the beginning. Word of the marriage fraud wedding spread through the city's elite circles like wildfire. Susan's father, furious that his daughter had been made a laughingstock, ensured that the story reached the partners at John's boutique investment firm. John, your personal life is your business, his boss had told him in a meeting I later heard about from a former colleague. But bigamy, forgery, and staging a fake wedding with paid actors? That's a psychiatric liability. We can't have a man with zero grasp of reality managing our clients' portfolios. He was fired for cause, his morals clause invoked to deny him a single cent of severance. By the end of the month, John was living in a $400 a week residential motel that smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. The man who once bragged about status was now hiding from the very actors he'd hired for his wedding, who were still calling him for their unpaid fees. He had gone from a luxury high-rise to a room where the only view was a cracked parking lot. He was finally living the life he thought I had, except he didn't have the character to survive it. Justice arrived, not in a storm, but in the cold, clinical reality of a courtroom. Because John had forged my signature on a legal divorce filing, he hadn't just committed a domestic mistake. He had committed a felony against the state. I refused to settle. I wanted the man who mocked my upbringing to understand the weight of the law he thought he was above. The forgery charges led to a suspended sentence and a massive fine, but the true punishment came from his own bloodline. I visited John's parents before the trial. I didn't go with anger. I went with the PI's files and a copy of the $1.8 million tax return John had called poverty. His father, a man of rigid, old-school integrity, watched the video of John bringing Susan into my home while I was away. He looked at the forged signatures. When John finally crawled back to them, begging for a loan to cover his legal fees, his father didn't open his wallet. He opened the front door. "You didn't just betray your wife, John," his father said, his voice echoing in the marble foyer. "You betrayed the dignity of this family. You mocked a woman who was outworking you 10-1. You are a thief of time and a fraud of a man." They disowned him entirely. His father revoked his access to the family trust and channeled those funds into a scholarship for single mothers, a final, poetic slap in the face to John's misogyny. John was left with nothing but the $30,000 he'd protected, which was promptly swallowed by his lawyers. I didn't stay to watch the final embers of his life burn out. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I accepted the vice president position at our global headquarters in London. I traded the frugal clerk mask for the reality of my success. I am no longer the woman who scrubs floors after a 10-hour day. I am married to a man who heads a sustainable energy firm, a man who doesn't see a housewife or a provider, but an equal. When I told him I was pregnant 6 months ago, he didn't complain about changing diapers. He immediately began restructuring his travel schedule to ensure he could take 4 months of paternity leave. I recently received a letter from a relative of John's. He's working as a night security guard for a construction site, living in a studio apartment with no central heating. He spends his days trying to rebuild his status on social media, posting old photos of the life I paid for. I didn't reply. Some patterns are better left in the past. I've realized that the greatest inheritance my mother gave me wasn't just the ability to save money. It was the ability to see the difference between a man who wants a partner and a man who wants a pedestal. Success is the loudest silence you can ever achieve. John tried to bury me in a fake divorce, but he only succeeded in digging his own grave. If you believe that a woman's power is her own to build and her own to keep, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of ultimate justice. I'll see you in the next one.